All right, diving in today, folks, we're tackling human enhancement, a topic with some seriously fascinating philosophical angles. I mean, when we think about self-improvement, right, regular exercise, needing glasses, learning an instrument, those feel like, well, improvements, but they don't usually send us into a philosophical tailspin, right?
No, not usually. We all kind of engage in self-improvement in different ways. But for this deep dive today, we're going hyper-specific. We're looking at the ethics, the really complex ethical considerations around what we call biomedical interventions for enhancement. So going beyond just restoring health or maintaining it. And this is where it gets interesting because healthcare professionals, parents, sporting bodies, even policymakers, they're all wrestling with some pretty profound questions in this space.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, this isn't just an academic exercise, is it? This has real-world implications. So our mission today, then, is to kind of break down these core philosophical considerations in this whole arena. We're going to explore three main areas, I think. So first, the whole issue of healthcare. Where do we draw the line? Second, the moral worries, the big ones. Fairness, authenticity, that whole idea of being true to oneself and even like what it means to be human, like at the most basic level. And then finally, we'll touch on the politics of it all. How do we even govern these emerging possibilities?
Exactly. And for you, our listener, with your philosophical background, we want to pay particular attention to the frameworks, the conceptual and ethical frameworks, really the fundamental principles that drive these discussions.
Okay, great. So let's unpack this a bit. Maybe we should just start with the words themselves. Human and enhancement, right? They seem simple enough, but even those terms carry some philosophical baggage, wouldn't you say?
For sure. For sure. Take human, for example. We can mean it in a purely biological sense, like just a member of the species Homo sapiens, right? But we also use it in a more, I guess, an evaluative sense, right? Often tied to moral status or those qualities we think are essential to being a person. A lot of the disagreements around enhancement, I think, stem from kind of unconsciously switching between these two meanings.
So you're suggesting that the real ethical crux of it isn't necessarily about some strict biological line.
That's exactly it. The core issues seem to be more about those evaluative aspects. What traits do we actually value and how might enhancements affect them? So to get our discussion going, a clear working definition of enhancement would be helpful, I think.
Okay, good point. What definition should we be using for this deep dive then?
Okay, so let's define enhancement as biomedical interventions that are used to improve human form or functioning, but going beyond what's necessary to restore or sustain health. This comes from Eric Parents, 1998, and it's been quite influential in the field.
That's a great starting point. And I guess what jumps out at me from that definition is that it's not about the technologies themselves being enhancements, right? It's about how they're used.
Precisely.
Yeah.
We don't really have these enhancement technologies as such, right? It's the application. I mean, take ankle surgery, for instance. If a cyclist has a real injury, surgery to repair it, that's clearly treatment. We're restoring normal function. But what if a perfectly healthy cyclist gets the same surgery to gain a competitive edge? That's when we start getting into enhancement territory.
Okay, but that makes the whole regulatory landscape pretty tricky, doesn't it? Because, someone could always argue a therapeutic rationale, even if it's mostly for, enhancing performance or appearance.
You've hit on a crucial point there. Developers can, and often do, point to these potential therapeutic uses to justify their research. But, and this is philosophically important, just because a technology can be used for both treatment and enhancement, that doesn't erase the logical distinction between those uses, right? And the possibility that they might need different ethical evaluations.
Right. The logic's still there, even if in the real world it gets a bit messy. Now, our definition mentions biomedical interventions. Why that focus? I mean, we enhance ourselves in all sorts of non-medical ways, don't we?
We absolutely do. I mean, we use digital tools, we cultivate certain lifestyles, social practices, all sorts of things can enhance our lives. But most of the philosophical work, the enhancement ethics literature, has really focused on those interventions that bring about biological changes. So changes in our bodies and brains through pharmaceuticals, surgery, genetic techniques, things like that.
So we're talking about things like cosmetic surgery to change your appearance or using growth hormone to make someone taller if they're otherwise healthy.
Exactly. Those are classic examples, as are practices like blood doping or using steroids, to boost athletic performance. And then there's psychopharmaceuticals, right? Aimed at enhancing cognitive functions like your memory or improving mood or focus. And if you look further ahead, there's the potential for genetic and neurological manipulations to, well, to do things like extend lifespan, give us new sensory experiences, or even, and this is where it gets really controversial, the concept of moral enhancement.
Wow, moral enhancement. Now, what about those more radical ideas you see in science fiction sometimes, like becoming cyborgs or uploading our minds?
Right, right. Fascinating stuff. And they definitely raise a whole other set of ethical and conceptual challenges. They're often seen as more extreme types of enhancement. But for the most part, our deep dive today is going to stick with those biomedical interventions. We'll only touch on those more radical concepts if they help us understand those core issues.
Okay, makes sense. So these biomedical enhancements, then, they typically target very specific capacities, right? It's not like a holistic approach to self-improvement like, I don't know, mindfulness or psychotherapy.
That's a key difference, yeah. And because of that, a lot of these enhancements come with potential trade-offs. Like imagine extending your lifespan significantly. You might live longer, but with increased frailty in those extra years. Or enhancing one trait, like extreme altruism, might unintentionally compromise something else important, like self-preservation. It's rarely a simple upgrade.
Right, right. It really highlights the complexity here. Okay, let's step back for a second and consider the bigger picture. Where did these debates even come from? What's the historical backdrop for all of this?
Oh, the historical context is crucial, I think, to really understand where we are now. On one level, the whole desire to improve ourselves, to strive for some ideal of perfection or betterment, it's deeply rooted in Western thought in both philosophy and religion. In a way, modern science and medicine have kind of inherited this underlying impulse.
So this isn't a new obsession, then?
Not at all, not at all. In fact, a lot of people on both sides of the enhancement debate share this fundamental desire, right, to improve. But they often have very different visions of what that ideal human should look like. Some worry about imposing one dominant idea of what it means to be better, and they stress individual autonomy, the freedom to define your own ideals. Others may be focused on the common good. They might be more confident in pointing to specific traits that should be preserved or, enhanced for the benefit of society.
But there seems to be a pretty broad consensus that using medicine to heal and treat illness is, well, it's a good thing, right?
Oh, absolutely. That near universal acceptance of medical interventions for therapeutic purposes, that's a key starting point. So when we move beyond that into the realm of enhancement, going beyond restoring health to achieve some kind of improvement in a healthy person, that's when the real disagreements start to pop up. And that's precisely why examining this distinction between treatment and enhancement is so important.
Okay, so that makes sense. The desire to be better isn't new. But there's a dark side to this history, too, isn't there? The whole specter of 20th century eugenics that casts a long shadow, doesn't it?
Oh, it does. It absolutely does. The eugenics movement, with its attempts to improve the human race through these often coercive, discriminatory reproductive policies, it's a powerful cautionary tale. It raises these deep questions about the authority of science, about the social values that shape how it's applied, and, well, the danger of slippery slope arguments, right? It's leading to these really unethical outcomes. It's a stark reminder of how things can go wrong when we try to engineer human traits based on, some social or ideological agenda.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think twice when you hear someone talking about improving the gene pool a bit too enthusiastically.
Absolutely. The history of eugenics has really shifted the burden of proof in these contemporary debates. Those advocating for enhancement, they have a much greater responsibility now to clearly distinguish their proposals from those earlier, very discredited ideologies. They need to articulate very clearly why their vision of enhancement wouldn't lead down a similar path.
Right, right. So beyond eugenics, what other contemporary developments have really shaped this conversation?
Several things come to mind. There's the increasing commercialization of beauty through what's often called aesthetic medicine, the widespread availability of cosmetic surgery and things like that. This raises all sorts of questions about societal pressures, the medicalization of normal human variation, the potential for exploitation. Then you have, of course, the whole history of performance enhancement in sports, all the doping scandals and such, which highlights that tension between the pursuit of excellence and the ideal of fair play. And we can't forget the advancements in human gene transfer technologies, initially focused on treating genetic diseases, but inevitably They raise the possibility and the ethical implications of genetic enhancement.
And we've seen critiques from feminist perspectives in disability studies too, haven't we?
Oh, absolutely. Those have been vital. They often point out how, prevailing societal norms about beauty, about ability, and even about health, they can really influence what we even see as needing enhancement. Sometimes prioritizing these culturally determined ideals over, addressing actual therapeutic needs or promoting well-being for everyone, the impact of doping on the social fabric of sports, how it goes beyond individual choice and affects the integrity of competition. That's another key area they look at. And we have to acknowledge the physical risks that come with many of these interventions, something we've learned from, the history of gene therapy and its setbacks.
It's like this whole area is woven together, right? Historical precedents and these really urgent contemporary concerns.
That's a great way to put it. These backstories, they shape how we think about and react to enhancement. They offer these cautionary lessons, but, it's also important to realize they can bring their own biases to the table. So a rigorous philosophical assessment, that's all the more necessary.
Okay, I like that, a fresh perspective. So, with all of that in mind, let's dig into one of those core considerations, the limits of healthcare. How does this treatment enhancement distinction actually work in practice when we're trying to define those limits?
Well, it often gets used to try and draw those boundaries, right? Like what healthcare professionals are obligated to provide, what insurance should cover, where research should focus its resources. The idea being that enhancement is kind of a natural upper limit to those things.
So if it's an enhancement, it falls outside what healthcare should be concerned with. That's the general thinking.
That's the prevailing notion, yeah.
Yeah.
Just like we have this concept of futile treatment to decide when intervention isn't working anymore. Right? Enhancements are often seen as going beyond the legitimate goals of medicine. They're chasing non-medical goals. So the thinking is you don't have a right to demand enhancements. Your insurance probably won't cover them. And anyone offering them, well, they might face more scrutiny, a higher burden of justification.
It sounds like this distinction is pretty crucial then for shaping healthcare policy and ethical guidelines.
It is. It really is. It's been embedded in policies at the professional level, at the governmental level, and it's still a focal point in public discussions about the future of medicine and human capabilities. But here's the thing. The ways we actually define and use this treatment enhancement line, they vary a lot. And each approach has its own strengths and weaknesses. Some would even say the distinction itself isn't as clear or stable as we think.
That's a little worrying, isn't it, for such a seemingly fundamental boundary? You mentioned earlier that this distinction is both descriptive and normative. Could you unpack that a little?
Sure. Descriptively, it's about identifying, right? Categorizing an intervention. Is it treatment to restore health? Or enhancement to improve on a healthy baseline? Then normatively, we need to understand what that means in terms of whether we should pursue it. Should doctors offer it? Should society pay for it? The tension is enhancements aim to improve well-being or capabilities, which is often the goal of healthcare anyway. So when we say enhancement in a policy context, we're saying this potential improvement, yeah, it might be nice, but it's outside the accepted scope of legitimate medical interventions.
It's like saying we want to make people better, but not that much better, not in that way.
You got it. And this tension has led to different attempts to really define that line, to make it concrete.
You mentioned three main approaches. Let's start with the first, the professional domain accounts. What's the logic there?
Basically, it says that treatments are those interventions that the healthcare professions, through their standards of care, their best practices, endorse as being within their domain. Enhancements are what they see as outside their proper role. Think about professional societies issuing guidelines that discourage certain practices, or insurers distinguishing between elective and medically necessary procedures.
So it relies on the consensus and practices within the medical community itself.
To a large extent, yes. For those who have a clear vision of what healthcare should be, this approach can be a way to critique practices that seem to go astray. It also fits with some libertarian views, emphasizing patient autonomy and the idea that the domain of healthcare is what doctors and patients agree on. If a patient wants it and a qualified professional will do it, then it's a treatment, right?
But that seems, potentially problematic. What if professionals don't agree? Or if their views change over time because of societal pressures or, commercial interests?
You've hit the nail on the head. That's the big limitation. We know from history and sociology that healthcare professions have often adapted They've expanded their scope in response to cultural beliefs, social values, economic opportunities, sometimes by medicalizing things that weren't medical before. So with all the diverse viewpoints within healthcare and their autonomy in setting standards, relying solely on professional consensus might not be a stable, principled way to exclude those novel interventions that are seen as enhancements. For policymakers who need clear boundaries, this approach could be a bit weak.
Okay, so professional consensus might not be the most solid way to draw the line. What about the second approach, the normal function account?
Right, so here the main idea is that health is essentially the ability to perform the functions, the physiological and psychological functions that are typical for our species, at a similar age and sex, within a statistically normal range. Treatment, then, is restoring someone to this normal level, if they fall below it because of illness or injury. Enhancement is taking them beyond that typical range.
So healthcare's goal is to get people to the baseline of what a healthy human is capable of.
Basically, yes. It seems to offer a pretty objective goal for healthcare, and we can often use, physiological data, clinical histories, to assess if someone's functioning within that species' typical range or if they've returned to their personal baseline.
That does sound more grounded in biological facts, but are there any criticisms of this approach too?
There are several big ones. A major concern is that this focus on normal functioning can be, insensitive to the diversity of human experience, right? To the experiences of people with disabilities. They might see this strong emphasis on a specific definition of normal as problematic, even exclusionary. Even if someone can't reach what's considered species-typical functioning, assistive technologies, environmental modifications, those can expand their opportunities, their well-being, maybe beyond what we consider normal. Should we then restrict those technologies just because they're seen as enhancing their capabilities beyond a statistical norm?
That does raise some really difficult questions about how we define normal and whether we should be limiting the potential of people with disabilities in that way.
Exactly. Another issue is, think about naturally gifted individuals. Even after recovering from an injury, they might be within the normal range, but way below their own exceptional abilities.
Yeah.
Would this account consider interventions to help them get back to that level as medically necessary or as enhancements? And then there's the whole challenge of defining optimal functioning versus normal functioning, especially as we learn more about human potential, as science advances.
And what about things like vaccines, preventative interventions? They boost our immune systems beyond a typical baseline. Where does the normal function account put those?
That's a big one. A lot of preventative measures, like vaccines, they're pretty much universally accepted as part of modern medicine. But they clearly aim to elevate bodily functions, in this case, immune response, disease resistance, above what we'd expect in an unvaccinated population. If we strictly adhere to treatment is restoring normal function, it's hard to call these preventative measures treatments. But if we accept prevention as a legitimate part of medicine, then, it weakens that argument for a hard line at enhancement, just meaning going beyond normal function.
So the normal function account, while it sounds objective, it has some holes, some practical difficulties. Which brings us to the third approach, the disease-based accounts. What's the central idea there?
This one says that treatment is any intervention aimed at a diagnosable disease or disability. Some philosophers call these maladies. Enhancements, on the other hand, target healthy systems, when there's no recognized medical condition.
Yeah.
So the key is there a medical condition that needs treatment?
So if you have a diagnosed illness or disability, interventions are treatment. But if you're healthy and just want to improve something, that's enhancement.
That's the gist of it. Like giving growth hormone to a child with a deficiency, that's standard treatment. But giving it to a healthy child just to make them taller, that's enhancement. It has a certain intuitive appeal, and it aligns with a lot of traditional medical practice, right? That whole, if it ain't broke, don't fix it idea. It also helps explain why, for instance, cosmetic surgeons sometimes frame their procedures as relieving mental conditions, like body dysmorphia, to fit them into a treatment model.
Makes sense. Seems straightforward enough. What are the problems with this disease-based approach, though?
Well, one issue, which it shares with the professional domain account, is something called nosological elasticity. Basically, it's how medicine can broaden its definitions of what counts as a disease. It's not always that hard to come up with new maladies that could include interventions that, some might see as enhancements, unless you have a super strict and often debated idea of what a disease really is. This approach might end up giving the power to define that line back to the medical profession, which then raises concerns about over-medicalization.
So the definition of disease itself becomes a battleground.
Exactly. But the bigger practical challenge is that most technologies with enhancement potential will probably have therapeutic uses too. They'll be developed and approved for treating specific conditions. Think about cognitive enhancing drugs that might be approved for Alzheimer's or ADHD, right? But then they become available off-label for healthy people who want a mental boost.
Whoa, that's a big regulatory hurdle. If it's legal for therapeutic use, how do you control its use for, well, non-medical enhancements?
That's the million-dollar question. The focus then shifts from regulating development to controlling access and use for non-therapeutic purposes. And it forces us to face a more basic ethical question. Even if doctors shouldn't provide enhancements, are there moral reasons why individuals themselves, athletes, students, parents, shouldn't use them if they're available? And this takes us to our next big question. Is using enhancements just a form of cheating?
Right, the classic debate about performance-enhancing drugs in sports, that seems like a clear-cut violation of the rules.
It does, and that's exactly why it's been so widely discussed. You have measurable improvements outside healthcare and within clear rules. The first concern is definitely cheating. If the rules say no enhancements, using them is an unfair advantage. It pressures others to do the same, to stay competitive, and it could lead to social divides based on who can access those enhancements.
But should sports rules inherently ban all enhancements? Is that something we should question more deeply?
For sure, for sure. Rules aren't set in stone, right? They change. In sports, we constantly see new tech, new training methods being adopted. If equitable access is an issue, sometimes you can address that through wider distribution or standardization, like with those high-tech swimsuits, the fast skin suits. The IOC had to respond to that. Sometimes inequalities, like geographical disadvantages in some winter sports, they just become accepted as part of the game.
Okay, so if everyone has equal access or if the rules allow it, does the cheating argument go away? What about a hypothetical Super Olympics where everyone's using some kind of enhancement?
Some philosophers use thought experiments like that to get to the core of it, beyond just rule breaking. Many critics argue that using biomedical shortcuts undermines the integrity of human practices. If accomplishments come mostly from, say, pharmacological or genetic interventions, not from training and dedication and natural talent, then their value, their meaning gets diminished. Think about the difference between studying hard for an exam and just popping a cognitive enhancing pill.
So it's not just about a level playing field, but also about preserving the value, the meaning of the achievement itself.
Exactly. Institutions, rulemakers, they need to think about what they're really evaluating, what they're rewarding, and whether certain shortcuts need to be banned to preserve the value of those things. In sports, there's a theory that the goal is the virtuous perfection of natural talents. So it's about celebrating those inherent abilities and the dedication people show in honing them. Enhancement, by altering those talents through, artificial means, it blurs the line between inherited and acquired abilities, and that undermines the whole purpose.
It's about keeping that distinction clear between innate ability and technological augmentation.
Yes. Sport, according to this view, is a system of values based on that development of our natural talents, and it celebrates the highest achievers. The worry is that enhancement disrupts that. But, and here's where it gets interesting, this fairness argument can backfire on those who are against enhancement. Because some argue that enhancements could actually make sports more fair, by leveling the playing field, mitigating those advantages some people have because of their genes. It raises the question, if we're already ranking people based on their biology, why not use tech to make it more about effort, strategy, training, not just who won the genetic lottery? Whether this applies to other social practices, that's a whole other debate.
That's a fascinating point. So enhancement equals cheating isn't so simple. That brings us to authenticity, right? Does enhancement compromise our sense of authenticity?
Right. This gets at the worry that achievements through enhancements might feel less real, less earned, kind of hollow. The concern is that we're losing something valuable about ourselves, like resilience, the experience of effort, personal growth, the role of chance and limitations. And there's the question of whether the enhanced person is still the author of their achievements.
There's this fear that we're drifting from our true selves somehow.
Exactly. But, as you know, defining true to oneself, or even having a stable self, that's a huge philosophical can of worms. A lot of these authenticity debates about enhancement, they don't really unpack their assumptions about the self. Are we talking about the authenticity of the self, our choices, our achievements, our actions? Which one is it?
It's not a single thing, is it? The meaning of authenticity probably depends on your whole view of personhood.
That's right. With all the debates in philosophy about personal identity, are we enduring selves or just bundles of experiences? It's no wonder there's no agreement on how enhancements might affect the authenticity of the self. We need to distinguish between just a feeling of unease and a solid philosophical argument about whether a specific enhancement is morally okay based on its supposed impact on authenticity.
So if someone says enhancements lead to inauthentic selves or achievements, we need to ask, which aspect of authenticity are you talking about?
Right. One argument is that you can't really take credit for something achieved through biomedical intervention, not from your own effort or skill. The enhancement is external, it takes over your agency, and the achievement isn't really yours.
But couldn't you say that choosing to be enhanced based on your own understanding and goals, that's also an expression of your agency?
That's what proponents argue. If you make an informed, voluntary choice, it's not clear why that diminishes your agency. And, we often hold enhanced individuals to higher standards of responsibility, which suggests we still see them as agents.
What about the argument that even if you're still acting, the achievements just don't have the same value? Think of a marathon runner using drugs.
The argument is that the value is separated from the process, from the personal investment. Running a marathon isn't just about finishing. It's the training, the endurance, the overcoming of limits. Or, like spiritual enlightenment, the value is in the journey of meditation, not just achieving a brain state through surgery.
So how we get there matters, not just the end result.
That's the claim. But some would say this just shows we value those unenhanced achievements for different reasons. Not that they're better. Maybe enhanced achievements have their own value that we haven't recognized yet. We've seen this throughout history, right? Concerns about new technologies changing things, ancient warriors who thought armor was less heroic, writers worried about keyboards ruining handwriting. Maybe it's about what we value as a society, how we assign meaning to things.
And then there's parental enhancement, right?
Yeah.
Choosing to enhance your children. There, the authenticity concerns are really front and center.
Absolutely. Because now the child, the one being enhanced, has no say. The argument is that by genetically engineering or, biomedically enhancing their kids, parents are taking away their chance to forge their own identity, experience the world in their own way, make choices about who they want to be.
It gets into those tough ethical questions about parental rights versus the child's autonomy.
It does. Taken to an extreme, this reasoning can get tricky, a bit like the wrongful birth debates, because the child, in their enhanced form, wouldn't exist without the intervention. It can also rely on a very deterministic view of genes. But the core concern points to attitudes about parenting, about procreation, that might be problematic even without demonstrable harm to the child. It makes us look at parental rights and responsibilities, in shaping their children's lives.
It's a delicate balance, that's for sure. Okay, so we've looked at the limits of healthcare, the worries about cheating and authenticity. Now, the big one are enhancements dehumanizing.
This takes us to the most fundamental level, right? How might enhancements impact our understanding of human nature and the future of our species? On one side, you have those dystopian visions of losing our humanity. On the other, you have transhumanists excited about transcending our limitations. The question is, how much should we value those traditional aspects of being human? Birth circumstances, natural talents, pain, suffering, aging, even death.
We're getting to the heart of what it means to be human and what we value about it.
Exactly. Moral philosophy has always looked to human nature for ethical principles. And while we can't just derive oughts from is, understanding what we cherish about being human is crucial for evaluating these radical interventions.
So what are some key features of human nature that come up in these dehumanization debates?
3 come up a lot. First, human vulnerability,
Mm.
suffering, aging, mortality. Some say this is tied to the value of life. It fosters empathy, resilience, our shared humanity. They worry that eliminating these vulnerabilities through enhancement might diminish something essential. Second, our embodiment and our place in nature. There are concerns, especially from environmentalists, about blurring species lines and, directed evolution, potentially with negative consequences. And third, our sociality. We're social creatures, we form relationships, hierarchies, we cooperate. Some argue, like we discussed with sports, that enhancements could dehumanize social practices by changing those hierarchies or the nature of our interactions.
It's interesting how those seemingly negative things, vulnerability, our limits, even social structures, are seen as contributing to the value of being human.
It is, but it cuts both ways, right? What creates meaning can also cause suffering. Enhancement proponents often point out that human progress has been about alleviating those vulnerabilities, overcoming limitations. So, just appealing to human nature isn't enough to decide which aspects to preserve and which to overcome.
The fear of creating post-humans being so enhanced that they're not recognizably human anymore, that seems to be a big one.
Yeah, and this leads to calls for tight regulations or bans on species-altering experiments. Some even call it a potential crime against humanity that undermines human rights. But, like we talked about earlier, defining species and what altering it means, that's super complex and contested. Species evolve, they're not static.
So trying to preserve a fixed human species might be unrealistic.
Exactly. And who decides what the untampered genome is, or what our genetic patrimony is? We're risking confusing the biological definition of human with its moral meaning. Being biologically human doesn't guarantee rights, and it's not clear that biological humanity is essential for moral standing.
The worry is that post-humans, with their new capacities, might challenge the basis of human rights for those who are unenhanced.
Right. If post-humans have vastly superior abilities, they might argue for more rights for themselves and reevaluate the rights of those without those enhancements. This could lead to hierarchies and, a resurgence of eugenic thinking.
That's a pretty dark picture.
It is. And while stopping post-humans completely might be impossible in the long run, some argue that we can protect our species' relativist values by rejecting those enhancements that alienate us from each other and undermine our shared identity. Normal evolution happens slowly, giving us time to adapt, but deliberate, rapid speciation through enhancement could outpace our ethical and social adjustments. But again, most enhancements we're discussing now are unlikely to cause that kind of immediate speciation.
And we can't forget about the environment's role in evolution, can we?
No, we can't. We can't control human evolution entirely from within, just through biomedicine. Environmental factors, natural and social, they'll always have an impact. And disability studies scholars, they rightly point out the issues with deciding which traits are desirable for enhancement, drawing parallels to eugenics. This idea of superior and inferior genotypes can reduce people to their genes and undermine the idea of moral equality, despite our biological diversity.
It sounds like those anxieties about violating human nature, while maybe hard to define precisely, they point to a depth concern about the future, especially given our past mistakes.
They do. They serve as important signals, even if they're not always easy to put into neat arguments. They highlight the implications for how we see ourselves, given our history of trying to better ourselves, often with bad results. Respecting our inheritance is important, but it doesn't dictate everything about our obligations to the future. Looking back should make us discuss positive visions for the future and create policies to protect those who might be left out of those visions. And while the human gene pool is probably pretty resilient, our respect, our tolerance, our empathy, those are more fragile, and those are the things we should really focus on preserving and maybe even enhancing as we navigate this new world of biomedical research.
This has been a really deep dive, a lot to think about. As we wrap up, what are some policy perspectives that we should consider?
I think the first big takeaway is that this desire for enhancement, it seems pretty fundamental to humans, and it's not necessarily bad in itself. Like many powerful technologies, it's specific applications that can be ethically problematic. Are they dangerous? Are they unfairly distributed? Do they undermine important values? So saying no to all enhancement is probably not helpful or philosophically sound.
So we need to look at specifics, not just take a blanket stance for or against enhancement.
Right. And this naturally leads to the idea of needing some kind of social control, regulation and